What happens when a music legend sits down for what should be a simple late-night talk show appearance, only to face the most disrespectful host in television history? In just 31 seconds, Jimmy Kimmel would say something so shocking, so completely out of line, that it would end his interview before it even truly began. This is the story of how Chaka Khan, the queen of funk herself, stood up to a man who thought he could say anything to anyone and get away with it. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday evening in Hollywood. Chaka Khan walked onto that familiar late-night set with her head held high, wearing a stunning golden dress that sparkled under the bright cameras. She had done this 1,000 times before. Talk shows were supposed to be fun, easy conversations about music, life, maybe a funny story or two. She was there to promote her new album, to connect with fans, to share her art with the world. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk with that trademark smirk, the one that made him think he was the funniest person in any room. The audience was already warmed up, ready to laugh at whatever came out of his mouth. But something felt different tonight. There was an edge in his voice during the commercial break, a nastiness that Chaka picked up on immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredible Chaka Khan," Jimmy announced as she made her entrance. The crowd erupted in applause. Chaka waved gracefully, took her seat on the guest couch, and prepared for what she assumed would be a normal interview. "Chaka, thanks for being here," Jimmy said, his fake smile already starting to crack. You look like you're trying really hard tonight." The first red flag. Chaka raised an eyebrow but kept her composure. "Thank you, Jimmy. I always try to look my best when I'm on television." Right, Jimmy nodded, shuffling his note cards. "So tell us about this new album. Are you still trying to prove you're relevant? Or have you accepted that your time has passed?" The audience gasped. You could hear the sharp intake of breath from 300 people all at once. Chaka's eyes flashed with anger, but she maintained her grace. "Excuse me? My time has passed? Jimmy, I've been making music longer than you've been alive. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone." Jimmy leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Well, let's be honest here. When was the last time you had a real hit? The 80s? The 90s? Music has moved on without you, hasn't it?" "Music has moved on without me?" Chaka repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Jimmy, I am music. I've influenced generations of artists. People you probably think are cool learned everything they know from listening to my records." The host chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Sure. But influence doesn't pay the bills, does it? That's why you're here, right? Trying to sell albums to people who remember when you were actually famous?" Chaka's jaw dropped. She looked out at the audience, many of whom were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some were even booing quietly. "Are you serious right now, Jimmy? What is wrong with you? I came here as a guest on your show, and you're treating me like I'm some has-been who should be grateful for the attention." "Well," Jimmy shrugged, "aren't you? When was the last time anyone under 30 knew who you were without looking it up?" That's when something changed in Chaka's posture. She sat up straighter, her eyes narrowed, and her voice became deadly calm. "Let me tell you something, Jimmy Kimmel. I was selling out arenas when you were still wetting the bed. I was making history when you were nobody, and I'll still be making music long after people forget you ever existed." Jimmy's smirk faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Wow, touchy subject. Look, I'm just being honest here. Your fans are dying off, literally. Old age, Who's gonna buy your music when they're all gone?" The audience was getting restless now. People were actually standing up, some heading for the exits. This wasn't funny anymore. This was cruel. Chaka looked directly into the camera and then back at Jimmy. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've worked with legends. I've created timeless music. I've earned respect from my peers and my fans. And I don't need to sit here and listen to some late-night host who peaked making prank calls try to tear me down for cheap laughs." "Oh, come on," Jimmy said, waving his hand dismissively. "Can't you take a joke? This is comedy. This is what we do here." "Comedy?" Chaka stood up from the couch, her golden dress catching the studio lights. "There's nothing funny about disrespect. There's nothing funny about trying to humiliate someone who came here in good faith. You call this comedy? I call it pathetic." Jimmy's face was starting to turn red. The control he thought he had over the situation was slipping away. "Sit down, Chaka. Let's just move on to the next question." "Move on?" Chaka laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, Jimmy, I'm not moving on. I want everyone watching to see exactly what kind of person you really are. This isn't about my age or my relevance. This is about you thinking you can say whatever you want to whoever you want because you have a television show. The cameras kept rolling. The producers in the control room were probably having panic attacks, but they couldn't stop this train wreck now. This was television gold, just not the kind anyone had planned for. Jimmy's producer was frantically waving from behind the cameras, trying to signal him to change course. But Jimmy Kimmel was too deep in his own ego to notice. He looked up at Chaka Khan, standing there in her golden dress, defiant and powerful, and instead of apologizing, instead of showing even an ounce of respect, he doubled down. "You know what your problem is, Chaka?" Jimmy said, leaning forward with that same cruel smirk. "You can't handle the truth. You're living in the past, holding on to glory days that happened before most of my audience was even born." Chaka's hands were trembling, not with fear, but with pure rage. My problem? My problem is that I'm sitting across from a man who thinks insulting his guests is entertainment. You want to talk about living in the past? You're still making jokes like it's 2003. "At least my jokes are current," Jimmy shot back. "Unlike your music. Tell me, when you perform these days, do you have to explain to the audience who you are first?" The few audience members who hadn't already left were now openly uncomfortable. Some were recording on their phones. Others were just staring in shock. This wasn't late-night television anymore. This was a public execution, except the victim was fighting back harder than the executioner had bargained for. "Jimmy," Chaka said, her voice steady but filled with power, "I've sold over 70 million records worldwide. I've won 10 Grammy Awards. I've been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. What exactly have you done besides sit behind a desk and make fun of people?" Jimmy's face was getting redder by the second. "I've built a career, Chaka. A current, relevant career. I don't need to live off achievements from decades ago." "Built a career?" Chaka laughed, and this time there was genuine amusement in it. "You mean you got lucky enough to get a time slot after better hosts retired? You're not building anything, Jimmy. You're just keeping a chair warm." That hit him where it hurt. Everyone knew Jimmy had always been in the shadow of better late-night hosts. Everyone knew he was never the first choice for anything. His jaw clenched as he tried to regain control. "You know what? Let's talk about something else," Jimmy said, shuffling through his cards again. "Let's talk about your personal life. All those marriages, all those relationships that didn't work out. Maybe that's why you're so angry all the time." The studio went dead silent. Even the cameraman looked shocked. You don't go after someone's personal life like that. Not on television. Not ever. Chaka's eyes went wide, not with hurt, but with absolute fury. "Are you out of your mind?" she said, her voice barely controlled. "Are you actually sitting there talking about my personal relationships on national television? Who do you think you are?" Jimmy shrugged like he hadn't just crossed the biggest line in show business. "I'm just asking questions that people want to know. Your love life has been pretty public. All those failed marriages, all those breakups, makes a person wonder if the problem isn't everyone else." Chaka took a step closer to his desk. The security guards in the wings tensed up, but she wasn't being threatening. She was being powerful. "There's a difference. Let me tell you something about my personal life, Jimmy Kimmel. Every relationship I've had, every marriage, every breakup, every success, and every failure has made me who I am today. A strong, independent woman who doesn't need anyone's approval, especially not from some third-rate comedian who thinks other people's pain is a punchline." "Third-rate?" Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. "I have one of the most successful shows on television." "Successful?" Chaka shook her head. "Jimmy, success isn't about ratings or time slots or how many people watch you. Success is about respect. Success is about legacy. Success is about making the world a little better than you found it. You're doing none of those things." Jimmy was spiraling now. You could see it in his eyes. He had lost control of this interview completely, and instead of trying to salvage it with grace, he was going nuclear. "You want to talk about legacy?" he said, his voice getting louder. "Your legacy is a bunch of old songs that people only remember because they play them in grocery stores. At least my show matters to people who are actually alive and relevant." The remaining audience members started booing. Not quietly this time, but loudly and clearly. They were booing Jimmy Kimmel on his own show. Chaka looked out at them and then back at Jimmy with something that almost looked like pity. "Jimmy, do you hear that? Do you hear your own audience turning on you? That's what happens when you forget that being on television is a privilege, not a right. That's what happens when you think being behind a desk makes you better than everyone else." Jimmy's hands were shaking now as he gripped his note cards. "They're not booing me. They're just caught up in the moment. They'll laugh when they watch it back." "No, Jimmy, they won't, because there's nothing funny about what you're doing. There's nothing entertaining about watching someone try to destroy another person for no reason, except that they can. The host tried one more desperate attempt to regain control. Look, Chaka, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? Talk about your music. Keep things light. Chaka stared at him for a long moment. Start over? After everything you just said? After you insulted my career, my age, my personal life? You think you can just wave a magic wand and pretend this didn't happen? It's television, Chaka. Things get heated sometimes. We're both professionals here. Professional? Chaka's voice rose again. Jimmy, there is nothing professional about what you just did. A professional treats their guests with respect. A professional asks thoughtful questions. A professional doesn't ambush someone who came here in good faith. Jimmy was completely out of ammunition now, but he couldn't stop himself from firing one last shot. Jimmy was completely out of ammunition now, but he couldn't stop himself from firing one last shot. His face was red, his hands were shaking, and his voice had that desperate edge of someone who knew they had already lost but couldn't admit it. You know what, Chaka? Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair with fake confidence. Maybe the reason you're so defensive is because you know I'm right. Maybe deep down, you know that your 15 minutes of fame ended a long time ago, and you're just here trying to squeeze out a few more seconds. The words hung in the air like poison. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Even the production crew had stopped what they were doing to watch this train wreck unfold. Chaka Khan stood there in her golden dress, and for a moment, she didn't say anything at all. Then she smiled. Not a happy smile, not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone who had just been handed the perfect opportunity to end this once and for all. 15 minutes of fame, she said quietly, her voice carrying more power than if she had been shouting. Jimmy, I've been famous longer than you've been alive. I was making hit records when you were still figuring out how to tie your shoes. And you know what the difference is between my fame and yours? Jimmy tried to interrupt, but Chaka held up her hand. The difference is that my fame came from talent. My fame came from hard work, from dedication, from creating something beautiful that touched people's hearts. Your fame? Your fame came from being in the right place at the right time and being willing to say anything, no matter how cruel, for a cheap laugh. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire. And you want to know something else about my 15 minutes of fame? Chaka continued, stepping even closer to Jimmy's desk. Those 15 minutes have lasted for over 4 decades. They've inspired countless artists. They've provided the soundtrack to people's lives, to their weddings, their celebrations, their moments of joy and sorrow. Jimmy's smirk had completely disappeared. He looked like a child who had just realized he was in serious trouble. Your 15 minutes of fame, Chaka said, pointing directly at him, started the moment I walked onto this stage tonight. Because after this, after people see how you really treat your guests, after they see what kind of person you really are when the cameras are rolling, this is all anyone is going to remember about Jimmy Kimmel. The host tried one desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Chaka, look, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This is just how late-night television works. We joke around, we have fun, we push buttons. It's not personal. Chaka's eyes narrowed. Not personal? Jimmy, you made it personal the moment you decided to attack my age, my relevance, my relationships, my entire life's work. You made it personal when you thought you could tear me down to build yourself up. I was just doing my job, Jimmy said weakly. Your job? Chaka's voice rose for the final time. Your job is to entertain people, not humiliate them. Your job is to make guests feel welcome, not attacked. Your job is to ask interesting questions, not insult everything someone has worked for their entire life. She turned to face the cameras directly, speaking to the millions of people watching at home. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight to talk about my music, to connect with fans, to share my art with the world. Instead, I've been subjected to the kind of treatment that no guest, no human being, should ever have to endure on national television. Jimmy made one last desperate plea. Chaka, please, let's just finish the interview. We can turn this around. Chaka turned back to him, and her voice was calm, steady, and final. Jimmy, there is no turning this around. There is no coming back from what you've done here tonight. You had a chance to interview a legend, to learn something, to maybe even be inspired. Instead, you chose to be cruel for absolutely no reason except that you thought you could get away with it. She started walking toward the edge of the stage, then stopped and turned back one more time. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy? In 20 years, when people talk about late-night television, when they talk about the great hosts and the memorable moments, no one is going to remember you for anything positive. They're going to remember you as the man who was so insecure, so threatened by real talent that he had to try to destroy it instead of celebrating it. Jimmy sat there speechless as Chaka Khan walked off his stage with more dignity and grace than he had shown in his entire career. The audience, what was left of them, erupted in applause. Not polite applause, not courtesy applause, but real, genuine applause for a woman who had just shown the world how to stand up for herself with class and power. As Chaka disappeared into the wings, Jimmy looked into the camera with the expression of a man who knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. The show went to commercial, but the damage was already done. In 31 seconds of pure disrespect and cruelty, Jimmy Kimmel had shown his true colors, and Chaka Khan had shown hers. The Queen of Funk had walked into that studio as a guest. She walked out as a legend who had just reminded the world that real class, real dignity, and real strength never go out of style. And Jimmy Kimmel? He was left sitting behind his desk, finally understanding that some people are too big, too talented, and too important to be torn down by a man with a microphone and an ego he couldn't control.